Marcus Chun had built an empire worth $3 billion, but every morning at exactly 7:47 a.m., he stood in line at a tiny coffee shop called Grounds and Grace like any ordinary person. The barista with auburn hair and gentle brown eyes always had his order ready before he reached the counter. A double espresso, no sugar, extra hot. She never asked his name, never made small talk, just handed him the cup with a polite smile that somehow made the bitter taste of his loneliness a little more bearable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The routine had become sacred to Marcus in a way that surprised him. For a man who commanded boardrooms and closed deals worth millions before most people finished their breakfast, this 5-minute interaction was the only genuine human connection in his carefully orchestrated days. He didn't know her name, had never asked, but something about her presence calmed the constant storm in his mind. Grace Winters wiped down the espresso machine for the third time that morning, her movements automatic after 2 years behind this counter. She had memorized the orders of every regular customer, but the tall man in the expensive suits intrigued her more than she cared to admit. He carried himself with the weight of someone who held too much responsibility, yet his eyes held a sadness that reminded her of her own reflection. Every morning, she prepared his coffee the moment she saw his black Mercedes pull into the parking space across the street. What neither of them knew was that 23 years ago, a desperate teenage girl had left her newborn daughter at St. Catherine's Hospital with nothing but a handwritten note and a silver locket bearing the initials MC. That girl had grown into a woman who became Mrs. Chun, wife to a rising tech entrepreneur who never knew about the child she had given away before they met. Marcus had built Chun Technologies from nothing, transforming a small software startup into a global corporation that revolutionized cloud computing. But success had come at a cost. His marriage to Eleanor had been built on shared ambitions rather than love, and when she died in a car accident 3 years ago, he discovered just how alone he truly was. No children, no close friends, just endless meetings and a bank account that grew larger while his world grew smaller. Grace had been raised by the kindly Sister Margaret at the children's home until she aged out at 18. She had studied business at community college while working nights at a diner, dreaming of opening her own cafe someday. The job at Grounds and Grace was supposed to be temporary, just until she saved enough money to pursue her real dreams. But the owner, Mrs. Patterson, had become like a grandmother to her, and the regular customers felt like the family she had never known. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Marcus walked through the glass door at exactly 7:47 a.m., his tailored charcoal suit immaculate despite the October drizzle outside. Grace had his espresso ready, the ceramic cup warm just the way he liked it. But as she turned to hand it to him, her sleeve caught the edge of the register, sending the cup tumbling toward the floor. Time seemed to slow as Marcus instinctively reached out, catching the cup before it could shatter. His fingers brushed against Grace's as he steadied it, and for a moment, they both froze. The touch was electric, not romantic, but something deeper, more primal, a recognition that neither could name but both felt in their bones. "I'm so sorry," Grace whispered, her cheeks flushing pink. "I'm usually not this clumsy." Marcus found himself studying her face more closely than ever before. The shape of her nose, the way her eyebrows curved, the small dimple in her chin. Something stirred in his memory, a fragment of a conversation with Eleanor years ago about a choice she had made long before they met. He pushed the thought away. "No harm done," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Actually, I've been coming here for months and I don't even know your name." "Grace," she replied, surprised by her own boldness. "Grace Winters." "Marcus," he said, though he suspected she already knew from hearing Mrs. Patterson address him by name. "Thank you for the coffee, Grace." As he left that morning, Marcus found himself glancing back through the window. Grace was watching him go, and when their eyes met through the glass, she offered a small wave. He returned it, feeling something shift inside his chest, like a door that had been locked for years finally creaking open. That evening, Marcus sat in his penthouse office overlooking the city, but his mind kept drifting back to the coffee shop. He pulled out his laptop and, almost without thinking, began searching for information about Grace Winters. What he found made his blood run cold. Grace had been born at St. Catherine's Hospital on March 15th, exactly 9 months after Eleanor had told him about her mistake from before they met. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Eleanor had been pregnant when she was 17, had given the baby up for adoption, and had never spoken of it again until one night when too much wine had loosened her tongue. Marcus stared at the screen, his hands trembling slightly. Grace had Eleanor's nose, her chin, her way of tilting her head when she was thinking. But she had his eyes, that same deep brown that he saw in the mirror every morning. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Grace wasn't just a barista who made his coffee. She was his daughter. The next morning, Marcus stood outside grounds and Grace for 10 minutes before he could bring himself to go inside. How do you look at someone you've been casually greeting for months and process the fact that she's your child? How do you explain that her mother, the woman who gave her life, was someone she would never get to meet? Grace noticed his hesitation through the window and felt a flutter of concern. When he finally entered, she had his espresso ready as always, but something was different in his demeanor. He seemed nervous, uncertain, qualities she had never associated with the confident businessman who commanded respect wherever he went. "Are you all right?" she asked, handing him the cup. "You seem distracted today." Marcus opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. How could he possibly explain what he had discovered? How could he tell her that he believed he was her father without sounding like a madman or, worse, someone trying to manipulate her? "Grace," he began carefully, "this might sound strange, but do you know anything about your birth parents?" The question hit Grace like a slap. She had spent years wondering about the people who had given her life only to give her away, but no one had ever asked her about it so directly. Most people either assumed she had a normal family or were too polite to pry. "Not much," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was left at the hospital when I was born. The only thing I have is this." She pulled a small silver locket from beneath her uniform shirt, opening it to reveal the faded initials M.C. Marcus felt the world tilt on its axis. The locket had belonged to Eleanor, a gift from her grandmother. She had worn it every day until it went missing shortly before Grace was born. Now he understood where it had gone. "Those initials," he said, his voice hoarse. "Do you know what they stand for?" Grace shook her head. "I always assumed they belonged to my mother, but I never found out for sure. Sister Margaret at the Children's Home said there was no other information in my file." The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too warm. Marcus needed air, needed space to think, but he also needed to know more. "Grace, would you be willing to meet me somewhere after your shift? There's something I need to tell you, something about those initials." Something in his tone made Grace's heart race. She had dreamed for years about someone coming forward with information about her parents, but now that the moment was here, she felt.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Terrified. What if the truth was worse than not knowing? "I get off at 3, she said quietly. "There's a park 2 blocks south of here, near the fountain." Marcus nodded, his mind already racing ahead to the conversation they would have in a few hours. How do you tell someone that their entire life is about to change? How do you explain that the stranger who has been buying coffee from them is actually their father? The rest of Grace's shift passed in a blur. She made lattes and cappuccinos on autopilot, her thoughts consumed by the mysterious conversation that awaited her. Mrs. Patterson noticed her distraction and asked if she was feeling well, but Grace couldn't even begin to explain the storm of emotions churning inside her. At 3 o'clock sharp, Grace found Marcus sitting on a bench near the fountain, still wearing his business suit, but looking more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. He stood when he saw her approaching, and she noticed that his hands were shaking slightly. Thank you for coming, he said as she sat down beside him. I'm not sure how to begin this conversation. Why don't you start with why you recognized my locket? Grace asked, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that once he spoke the words, there would be no taking them back. Because it belonged to my wife, Eleanor Chun. She lost it 23 years ago, right around the time she gave birth to a daughter she placed for adoption. Grace stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he was saying. You think you're my. I think I'm your father, Marcus said quietly. And I think Eleanor was your mother. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that neither was sure they wanted to cross. Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes, years of wondering, and hoping and fearing all crashing together at once. But how is that possible? She whispered. If she was your wife, why didn't you know about me? Marcus closed his eyes, remembering the conversation he had tried so hard to forget. Eleanor was 17 when she got pregnant. The father was older, married, someone who couldn't acknowledge the child. She gave you up before we ever met. She only told me about it once, years later, when we had been trying to have children of our own and couldn't. And you never tried to find me? The pain in Grace's voice cut through Marcus like a knife. I didn't know your name, didn't know where you were placed. Eleanor said it was better that way, that you had a chance at a real family. And honestly, I was focused on building my business, on our marriage. I pushed it to the back of my mind. Grace stood up abruptly, pacing to the edge of the fountain. So for 23 years, I've been wondering who I am and where I came from. And you've been buying coffee from me for months without knowing that I'm your daughter? I know how this sounds, Marcus said, standing to face her. I know it. Seems impossible, but Grace, look at me. Really look at me. Grace turned to study his face, seeing him clearly for the first time. The eyes that she had inherited, the way he held his shoulders, even the shape of his hands wrapped around his coffee cup every morning. The resemblance was undeniable once she allowed herself to see it. The locket, she said suddenly. You said it belonged to your wife. What happened to her? Marcus's face fell. Eleanor died 3 years ago in a car accident. She never got to know that I found you. Never got to meet the daughter she gave up. The revelation hit Grace like a physical blow. Not only had she found her father, but she had lost her mother without ever knowing her. The grief was immediate and overwhelming, mourning someone she had never met but had wondered about every day of her life. I need time, Grace said, backing away from the bench. This is too much. I need to think. Marcus watched helplessly as she walked away, disappearing into the late afternoon crowd. He had found his daughter only to lose her in the same conversation. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had spent months learning her coffee preferences but had no idea how to reach her heart. That night, Grace sat in her small apartment above the used bookstore, staring at the locket in her palm. Everything she thought she knew about herself had been turned upside down in the span of one conversation. She wasn't just an abandoned child anymore. She was the daughter of a billionaire and a woman who had died before they could ever meet. Part of her was angry at Marcus for keeping this information to himself once he suspected the truth. Part of her was angry at Eleanor for giving her up without leaving any way to be found. But underneath the anger was something else: hope. For the first time in her life, she knew where she came from. Marcus, meanwhile, sat in his empty penthouse, surrounded by the trappings of success that felt meaningless in light of what he had discovered. He had built an empire, but had missed 23 years with his daughter. How do you make up for that kind of lost time? The next morning, Grace didn't show up for work. Mrs. Patterson called her apartment, but there was no answer. Marcus arrived at Grounds and Grace at his usual time to find a different barista behind the counter, a teenager who had never seen him before and took 5 minutes to make his espresso incorrectly. "Where's Grace?" he asked Mrs. Patterson when she emerged from the back office. "She called in sick," the older woman replied, studying Marcus with shrewd eyes. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about why my best employee suddenly needs a mental health day, would you?" Marcus realized that Grace must have trusted Mrs. Patterson enough to confide in her. We had a difficult conversation yesterday, he admitted. About her family. Mrs. Patterson nodded slowly. That girl has been like a granddaughter to me for 2 years. If you hurt her, Mr. Chun, billionaire or not, you'll answer to me. The threat would have been amusing if it weren't so heartfelt. This woman who barely reached his shoulder was prepared to defend Grace against anyone, including him. It made Marcus realize just how many people cared about his daughter, how many relationships she had built while he had been living in isolation. Grace spent 3 days walking the city, thinking about everything that had changed and everything that remained the same. She was still the same person who had grown up in foster care, who had worked her way through college, who dreamed of opening her own business. But now she had answers to questions that had haunted her since childhood. On the fourth day, she returned to work. Marcus was there at his usual time, and when she handed him his espresso, their eyes met for a long moment. I've been thinking, Grace said quietly, about what you told me. Marcus felt his heart race. And I want to know more. About Eleanor, about you, about why she made the choice she did. But I need this to happen slowly. I can't just suddenly become your daughter after 23 years of being nobody's child. Marcus nodded, relief flooding through him. Whatever. Pace you're comfortable with. I don't want to overwhelm you. Maybe we could start with lunch, Grace suggested. Somewhere we can talk without customers listening in. I'd like that, Marcus said, meaning it more than he had ever meant anything in his life. Their first lunch was awkward, two strangers, trying to navigate a relationship that should have been built over decades. Marcus told Grace about Eleanor, about how they had met in college and built their life together around shared dreams of success. Grace told him about growing up in the children's home, about Sister Margaret who had been more mother to her than anyone else. But slowly, over weeks of careful conversations, something began to build between them. Not the instant bond of parent and child, but something more tentative and precious, the beginning of trust. Marcus learned that Grace was brilliant with numbers, that she had a business degree and dreams of entrepreneurship that she had set aside for financial stability. Grace learned that beneath his intimidating exterior, Marcus was deeply lonely and had been questioning the meaning of his success long before he discovered her existence. What would you do? Marcus asked one afternoon as they sat in a quiet cafe across town. If money weren't an issue? If you could pursue any dream you wanted? Grace's eyes lit up in a way he had never seen before. I'd open a community coffee shop, she said without hesitation. Not just a place to get caffeine, but a real gathering place. Somewhere people could work, hold meetings, take classes. Somewhere that felt like home to people who maybe don't have one. The passion in her voice reminded Marcus of himself 20 years earlier, when Shun Technologies had been nothing more than an idea scribbled on napkins. He saw Eleanor in Grace's determination, but he also saw something uniquely her own, a desire to build something that served others rather than just accumulating wealth. Tell me more, he said, leaning forward with genuine interest. As Grace outlined her vision, describing everything from the layout to the menu to the community programs she would offer, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years: excitement. About a project that wasn't his own. This wasn't about expanding his empire or increasing his net worth. This was about helping his daughter build something meaningful. Have you written a business plan? He asked. Grace laughed, but there was sadness in it. I've written dozens. But banks don't tend to loan money to coffee shop employees with no collateral. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, then reached into his briefcase and pulled out a legal pad. Walk me through the numbers, he said. Startup costs, projected revenue, operating expenses, everything. For the next 2 hours, Grace shared every detail of the business she had dreamed about but never believed she could afford. Marcus asked questions, made suggestions, and watched his daughter transform from a cautious young woman into a confident entrepreneur. This was the person Eleanor's child was meant to become. When they finally left the cafe, Marcus turned to Grace with an expression she couldn't quite read. I want to invest in your business, he said simply. Grace stopped walking. What? Not as a gift, Marcus clarified quickly. As a legitimate business investment. You put together a formal proposal, and I'll consider it through my investment firm. No special treatment because you're my daughter, but no dismissal because you're young either. Grace felt tears threatening again, but this time they were. Tears of possibility rather than grief. You would do that? Grace, Marcus said seriously. I missed 23 years of your life. I can't get that time back, but I can help you build the future you want, if you'll let me. The word daughter still felt strange between them, but something else was growing in its place. Not the automatic love of blood relatives, but the chosen bond of two people who recognized something valuable in each other. Over the following weeks, Grace worked on her business proposal with a dedication that impressed even Marcus. She researched locations, refined her financial projections, and developed detailed plans for the community programs she wanted to offer. Marcus provided guidance when asked, but was careful not to take over the project. The day Grace presented her proposal to Marcus's investment committee was terrifying for both of them. Grace because her dream was finally within reach, and Marcus because he was watching his colleagues evaluate his daughter's work without knowing their relationship. The presentation was flawless. Grace had prepared for every question, anticipated every concern, and demonstrated a level of business acumen that surprised even Marcus. When the committee voted unanimously to approve the investment, Grace maintained her professional composure until she reached the hallway, where she finally allowed herself to cry with relief. Marcus found her there a few minutes later, and for the first time since they had learned the truth about their relationship, he opened his arms and she stepped into them. The hug was tentative at first, then stronger as 23 years of distance began to close. Congratulations, he whispered against her hair. You're going to build something amazing. We're going to build something amazing, Grace corrected. And Marcus felt his heart swell with a pride he had never known was possible. The next few months passed in a whirlwind of activity. Grace quit her job at Grounds and Grace with Mrs. Patterson's blessing and threw herself into preparing for her new venture. She found the perfect location, a historic building in a diverse neighborhood that needed exactly the kind of community gathering place she envisioned. Marcus watched from a careful distance as Grace transformed from employee to entrepreneur. She hired contractors, interviewed potential staff, and developed relationships with local suppliers. She was methodical and determined, qualities she had clearly inherited from both her parents. The grand opening of Haven Coffee was everything Grace had dreamed and more. The space was warm and inviting, with comfortable seating areas, a small stage for local musicians, and a community board where people could post job openings, apartment listings, and invitations to local events. Marcus stood in the back of the crowded shop, watching Grace work behind the counter with the same grace and efficiency she had shown at Grounds and Grace, but now with the confidence of someone pursuing her passion rather than just paying bills. You know, said a voice beside him, I think this might be the first time I've seen you smile in 3 years. Marcus turned to find Mrs. Patterson standing next to him, her sharp eyes taking in the scene before them. She's remarkable, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, she is, Mrs. Patterson agreed. And lucky for her, she found a father who recognizes that. As the evening wound down and the last customers filtered out, Grace found Marcus helping her clean tables without being asked. They worked in comfortable silence, and Grace realized that this felt right in a way that nothing else in her life ever had. Thank you, she said finally, for believing in me, for investing in this dream. Marcus paused in his wiping and looked at her seriously. Grace, I need you to understand something. I didn't invest in this because you're my daughter. I invested because you're brilliant and passionate, and you're going to make this place extraordinary. Grace smiled, the same gentle expression that had drawn him to the coffee shop counter months earlier, before he knew who she was. I know, she said, but I'm still grateful that my father believes in me. It was the first time she had called him that directly, and the words settled between them like a bridge finally completed. Not the father who had raised her, because that hadn't happened, but the father who had chosen to be part of her life once he found her. As they locked up Haven Coffee that night, Marcus realized that his daily routine had fundamentally changed. Instead of stopping by a coffee shop for 5 minutes of anonymous human contact, he now had a daughter who called him when she needed advice, who texted him pictures of particularly beautiful latte art, who had given him a purpose beyond accumulating wealth. Grace, meanwhile, had discovered that having a father wasn't about someone taking care of her financially. It was about having someone who celebrated her successes, supported her through challenges, and saw her potential even when she doubted herself. 6 months after Haven Coffee opened, Grace was preparing for the shop's first anniversary celebration when she received an unexpected visitor. Sister Margaret, now in her 70s but still sharp as ever, walked through the front door during the afternoon lull. "My goodness," the nun said, looking around the bustling cafe. "When I heard that one of my girls had opened her own business, I had to come see for myself." Grace rushed around the counter to embrace the woman who had been the closest thing to a mother she had known for most of her life. "Sister Margaret, I can't believe you're here." "I couldn't miss this," Sister Margaret said, her eyes twinkling. "Besides, I wanted to meet this father of yours that you've been telling me about in your letters." As if summoned by their conversation, Marcus walked through the front door, arriving for his new daily routine of checking in on Haven Coffee. He stopped short when he saw Grace embracing an elderly nun, immediately understanding who this must be. "Sister Margaret," Grace said, her voice warm with affection, "I'd like you to meet Marcus Chun, my father." The introduction still felt new and precious on Grace's tongue. Sister Margaret studied Marcus with the same shrewd assessment that Mrs. Patterson had given him months earlier, and he realized that his daughter had been blessed with many protective figures throughout her life. "Mr. Chun," Sister Margaret said finally, extending her hand, "I'm pleased to meet the man who gave Grace life, and then had the wisdom to step back and let her build her own." The conversation that followed revealed the careful balance that Marcus and Grace had found in their relationship. They were learning to be family without erasing the 23 years that Grace had lived without him. Marcus had become a mentor and supporter rather than trying to be a traditional father, and Grace had opened her heart to having him in her life without feeling obligated to fill a role that no longer fit. "You know," Sister Margaret said as the three of them sat around one of Haven Coffee's corner tables, "I always told the children that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who choose to love you and support you, regardless of how you find each other." Grace looked around her coffee shop, filled with the customers who had become regulars, the employees who felt more like friends, and now the father she had found and the woman who had raised her. She realized that she had built exactly what she had always been searching for, a place that felt like home, surrounded by people who had chosen to be her family. As the sun set over the city that evening, Marcus stood behind the counter of Haven Coffee, learning to operate the espresso machine under Grace's patient instruction. He was terrible at it, producing coffee that was either too weak or bitter enough to strip paint. But Grace laughed at each failed attempt and showed him again. "I think I'll stick to the business side of things," Marcus said after his fifth unsuccessful espresso. "Probably for the best," Grace agreed, grinning as she dumped his latest creation down the sink. "But I'm proud of you for trying." The word proud hit Marcus unexpectedly. He had spent his entire adult life chasing external validation, building a company that impressed competitors and accumulating wealth that commanded respect. But hearing his daughter say she was proud of him for something as simple as attempting to make coffee meant more than any business award he had ever received. "I'm proud of you too," he said quietly. "Not just for this place, but for the person you've become despite everything you went through." Grace paused in her cleaning, looking at the man who had unknowingly shaped half of her DNA, but was now actively choosing to shape her future. "We make a good team," she said finally. "Yes," Marcus agreed, looking around the coffee shop that represented so much more than a business investment. "We do." As Haven Coffee prepared to close for the night, neither Marcus nor Grace could have imagined that their story would become local legend. Word had spread about the billionaire who had discovered his long-lost daughter through a daily coffee routine, and about the young woman who had turned a chance encounter into a thriving business with her father's support. But more than the fairy tale aspect of their reunion, people were drawn to the genuine warmth of their relationship. Customers could see that this wasn't about money or obligation, but about two people who had found something valuable in each other and chosen to build on it. Grace had learned that having a father meant having someone who believed in her dreams enough to invest in them, who celebrated her successes without taking credit, and who offered support without trying to control her choices. Marcus had learned that being a father meant letting go of regret about the past and focusing on being present for the future. Their story wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, times when the gap of 23 years felt insurmountable, conversations that touched on painful subjects neither was ready to explore. But they had built something real and lasting from an impossible beginning. As Marcus drove home that night, he thought about the empty penthouse that awaited him. But for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a monument to his isolation. It felt like the place he rested between visits to Haven Coffee, where his daughter was building the life she had always been meant to live. Grace locked up her coffee shop and climbed the stairs to her apartment, which she had chosen to keep despite Marcus's offers to help her find something larger. This was her space, earned through her own work, a reminder of how far she had come. But now it also felt like home base between family dinners and business meetings with her father. Neither of them had known what they were missing until they found each other, but now neither could imagine their lives without the other in it. They had discovered that family isn't always about the people who raise you. Sometimes it's about the people who find you when you're both ready to be found. The morning routine had changed, but in the best possible way. Instead of a lonely man seeking 5 minutes of human connection, Marcus now arrived at Haven Coffee to check on his daughter's thriving business and to steal a few minutes of conversation before her day got busy. Instead of serving coffee to strangers, Grace now got to share her passion with someone who understood the dreams that drove her. Some stories begin with once upon a time, but theirs had begun with a simple order: double espresso, no sugar, extra hot. It had taken months for them to learn each other's names and a lifetime for them to become family. But in the end, the best relationships are worth the wait. Their story proved that sometimes the family you're looking for is closer than you think, hidden behind a counter, disguised as routine, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And sometimes the love you've been searching for isn't romantic or dramatic, but quietly dependable, served daily with exactly the right amount of warmth. Marcus Chun had built an empire worth billions, but his greatest achievement was learning to be a father to a daughter who had never stopped hoping she would be found. Grace Winters had spent 23 years wondering where she belonged, only to discover that home wasn't a place at all, but the people who choose to love you exactly as you are. In the end, they had both been exactly where they needed to be, separated only by the width of a coffee counter and the courage it took to bridge 23 years with two simple words: hello, daughter. Hello, dad. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.